All right, hey guys, it's Mr. Difilippo, your history teacher here, and I'm here at the historic Nemacolin Castle. We're here in the courtyard here in Brownsville, just right across the bridge. And we got a video because our final unit of study in history class was the American Civil War. And I'm here today with Brian Brashear, and he is representing the
116th Pennsylvania Infantry, Company A.
And local men from right around here, Brownsville, California. Whenever the war broke out in 1861, they all took arms and joined the fight to preserve the Union. So Mr. Brashear is going to go through and show you what an infantry soldier, what they would have done and what they would have used during the time. So hope you enjoy.
Hi everyone, my name is Brian Brashear and I'm with the Brownsville Historical Society. I'm a living historian here, and we're on the grounds at Nemacolin Castle. And today what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be giving everyone an idea of what life was like for a Pennsylvania soldier in the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give everyone an idea of the uniform that a soldier would wear in the Union Army. I'll start at the top. If you look at my hat, this is called a forage hat. You can see it's kind of floppy. Reason being, if soldiers were out foraging for fruits or vegetables, berries, whatever they needed, they would be able to just pile them inside their hat here and be able to go off on the march. If you look at the top of the hat, you can see the 116 is the regiment, 116th Pennsylvania, Company A, and the horn that you see here designates infantry. There's infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Cavalry would be crossed swords, and artillery would be crossed cannons. And the little harp you see on the side here denotes that this is part of the Irish Brigade that fought at battles like Gettysburg, Antietam, Fredericksburg, and so on. So that's the hat. And moving down, you can see my jacket. This is called a sack coat. It's a 4-button wool jacket, dark blue, and the trousers are actually a kersey blue or a sky blue color. And around my waist, you can see my belt. Of course, the U.S. denotes United States. Over on my left hip, I have what's called a bayonet, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. It goes on on the muzzle of the rifle there. And over here on my right hip, you're going to see this is a cap pouch. I would keep percussion caps in here to be able to discharge the weapon in the heat of battle. On my feet, you're going to see shoes. These are called brogans. Now they're basically just basic shoes. There's really nothing fancy about them. If you were in the Union Army, you had the benefit of being able to get decent footwear. If you were in the Confederate Army, not always so much. Your shoes would wear out on the march, and a lot of times Confederate soldiers would actually have to march barefoot, especially in the later parts of the war from 1863 to 1865. So you can see down around below my knee here, I have my socks over top of the bottom of my trousers. Now, especially during the summer months, it was not uncommon for soldiers to do this. Reason being is if you were marching through open fields and forested territory, you would have to try to keep ticks and other bugs out from crawling up under your pant leg. So a lot of times soldiers would tuck their trousers into their socks there, so that didn't happen. And also it would help preserve the length of your trousers, and they wouldn't get torn up or have holes in the bottom of them, as would happen all too often while soldiers were moving on the march. So what did soldiers carry with them? What did they have with them in camp? If you look down here on the blanket, I'm going to show you some of the items that they would have. So the first thing I'm holding here in my hand is a little sewing kit. Soldiers referred to this as a housewife. Reason being is if you were out in the field, a lot of times you would get holes in your uniform and you would need to repair those holes by being able to sew. If you joined the Army and you didn't know how to sew, believe me, by the time you were discharged, you knew how to do it. But the main thing that soldiers would do with this is back in the Civil War, soldiers didn't have dog tags in the Army like they have today. And the fear of being killed in battle and not knowing who you were was a great fear amongst Union soldiers in the Army. So what they would do is they would take a needle and thread and actually sew their name in the back of their jackets. So if they were killed on the battlefield, their families would be able to know exactly what happened to them and they could be identified. So a housewife was a very, very important thing for the Union soldiers. Over here, this is a demonstration of some of the ammo that soldiers would carry. These are for an Enfield rifled musket, which is what you see down here, and I'm going to talk about the musket in just a few minutes. But moving on, you can see that soldiers also had tobacco. Now, if you were in the Union Army, later on in the war, this became harder to get because most of the tobacco came from the American South, and of course, North and South were at war. So what would happen oftentimes is soldiers would trade things with each other. They would trade tobacco for coffee or newspapers or anything that they can get their hands on that the other side might want, tobacco included. So moving on, a lot of times soldiers would write letters home. It got boring in camp, so they would write as many letters as they could. A lot of the soldiers actually couldn't read or write, so they would have soldiers that could actually pen the letters for them. Then they would bundle them up and they would send them off to be sent back north, back to their families back home in Pennsylvania. Some personal items that they might have. This is tooth powder. Soldiers may carry things like this just to keep personal hygiene up. And if you look at some money, money was actually different back in the days of the Civil War, especially in the early days. There wasn't exactly a wide currency like we have today. Money was issued by individual banks. This is the Montgomery County Bank of Pennsylvania, and it's a note that's worth $1. So you could actually spend this wherever it was that you needed to spend it. And soldiers would also have things like candles for night when it would get dark. They would have lanterns, but if they didn't have lanterns, what they would do oftentimes is they would take their bayonet, they would stick it in the ground, and they would just put a candle inside the bayonet. So the bayonet, as well as being a tool of war, also became a practical use as a candle holder. Now, no matter what denomination you were in the Union Army, if you were Catholic, Protestant, Episcopalian, whatever, you were issued this prayer book, and all the prayer books were the same. And it had a lot of things in it. It had psalms, it had hymns, and even in the back, there's a section for funeral rites, just in case someone you know may have fallen in battle and you wanted to say a few words before they carried them off. Soldiers would carry things in small little poke sacks like this. You could put anything in here. You could put a little bit of food. You could put some other things that you might have that are really small. They would put this inside their haversack and carry it off with them. And you can see playing cards here. Again, I mentioned the boredness in camp. If there wasn't anything going on, you had to find a way to occupy yourself. And if you weren't drilling or writing letters home, soldiers would oftentimes play cards. Now, if you look at these cards closely, what do you notice about them? There are no numbers or letters on them. That didn't happen until the beginning of the 20th century, around World War I. So soldiers actually had to memorize the pattern on how many symbols were on the card. This was a luxury. This was soap. If you were lucky enough to come across a bar of soap, believe me, chances are you probably didn't keep it all for yourself. You probably had to share it with your buddies who would want to trade things for it, but you would probably just go down to the creek and be able to wash yourself up. But a lot of times soldiers that were off on campaign and out in the field didn't have a luxury like soap, but if you were lucky enough to get it, you definitely made the most of that experience. Of course, more personal hygiene. You would be able to use a comb. Soldiers didn't always have time to take good care of their hair back then. They didn't have all the amenities that they needed, but being able to have a comb was also a luxury. Now, they did have matches back in the 1860s. They were actually called lucifers, but this is an example of what some matches would look like. They're very small, and they would be used to start fire. But if you were out in the field and you didn't want to use all of your matches, there was another way to do it. This is a little fire starting kit. I'm going to show you here inside. Of course, you'll see fire starting materials. There's some flint and some steel there to be able to make a spark if you wanted to start the fire that way. And also, if it's a nice sunny day like today, you would take the top of the kit and you would be able to aim it at the sun to be able to start a fire that way, to be able to use the magnifying glass to be able to get a spark. Now, this would take a really long time, so you really had to have a lot of downtime in camp to be able to start a fire that way, but that did save the life of your matches in case you needed them down the road. So as far as meals, a soldier would have his own tin plate. He would have an eating utensil like the fork you see here. And soldiers ate a lot of what's called hardtack. Now, this is basically just a flour and water biscuit, and it could be eaten quickly on the march. They did have other food. They had salt pork and things like that to be able to eat as they were marching, but hardtack was a staple of the Union Army. Sometimes it was so hard that the soldiers would have to pour coffee and break the hardtack up in the coffee to be able to soften it up. It wasn't at all uncommon for soldiers to bite into it and actually break teeth because of the hardness of the hardtack. Soldiers also had a little cup, and they would use this to be able to put their beverages in, and they could also, if they were having anything that was liquid to be able to eat, they could put it and eat out of here. And this was a big time staple of the Union Army, of course, coffee. The northern states always had enough coffee, but the southern states didn't. Hence the trading I was talking about, tobacco for coffee. The South wanted coffee, the North wanted tobacco, and soldiers would oftentimes, if they weren't fighting each other, would meet down at a creek or in the middle of a forest somewhere and say, hey, we'll trade you some coffee for some of your Johnny Rib tobacco. And they would actually fraternize along those lines. Now, Union soldiers drank a lot of coffee. Some of them drank as much as 4 pints of it a day. Now imagine drinking 4 pints of coffee. That would kind of help you march 35 miles, as some soldiers would march on a given campaign. And all of your food items would be stored in what's called a haversack. Now your haversack, it opened up just like this, and you would put your plate and your cup and all of your food or your apples or peaches or whatever it was that you had inside the haversack there. So you would then put this over your shoulder and it would hang on your left hip. And you can see that the haversack here is black and it has like a tarry look. That's because it was tarred to be able to keep out any kind of water that might seep in through rain or through crossing a river or a creek. So that's why it's called the black tarred haversack. So at the beginning of the war, soldiers were actually issued knapsacks that they would wear on their backs to be able to march along on campaign. But they became very cumbersome, and a lot of the soldiers just discarded them, especially in the soldiers who were serving in the farther southern states, because what would happen is it would get to be like 100 degrees in the south. So they wouldn't want to carry those big cumbersome knapsacks. So what they would do is they would take all of their items that you see here, minus the rifle of course, and they would just roll it all up. And they tie the ends and make what's called a blanket roll or a bed roll. And I actually made one up here. And what they would do is they would throw this over their shoulder, and instead of wearing everything on their haversack or on their knapsack on their back, they would roll it up in the blanket roll and put it on their shoulder and just be able to march away very quickly. So that would save space, and it would also take a lot of the weight off of the back of a soldier who was already carrying a lot of weight with the rifle and everything else that he had to be able to do so. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is, where did the soldiers sleep? Well, if you look behind me, you can see that there is a small tent here. This is actually called a dog tent. Now soldiers, especially during the campaigning season, late spring, during the summer and into the early fall, would carry these tents with them. If you see, you can look closely along the ridge of the tent there, it buttons. That's because it comes apart. And what would happen is, myself, I would carry one half, and another soldier would carry another half. So they were called shelter halves, and then whenever we were ready to camp for the evening, we would just button them together, and the tent, of course, would hold 2 people. Now, it didn't offer a lot of protection from the elements. It did keep you dry when need be, but in the winter months, soldiers would go into what was called winter quarters, so they wouldn't be staying in the dog tents very much then. If you look here, this is called a cartridge box. This is where a soldier would hold all of his powder and ammunition, and this would be worn over the left shoulder and on the right hip. Now if you look closely, you can see the box plate there. That's actually the state seal of Pennsylvania. And if you look here, you can see this is called a breastplate. It has the Federal Eagle, and this is how a soldier would carry all of his arms and all of his ammunition and powder. And of course, a soldier's best friend was always his canteen, because when you're on the march, the first thing that's going to happen is your feet are going to hurt and you're going to get thirsty. So if you were thirsty and you had a full canteen, that was always a good thing. So soldiers would carry their canteen and drape it over their right shoulder on top of their haversack on their left hip. And another thing I'm going to show you here is, these are the colors. Now you're going to notice that this is a flag of a Pennsylvania company. Now the thing about these flags, you're going to notice also that they're very large. They're bigger than most flags that you see. They're a large, square, rectangular formation. Reason being is, if you're on the battlefield and you're in the heat of battle, you may not always be able to hear the bugle calls that may be being called to tell you to advance or to retreat or to fall back. And if you look and you can see your company's colors, they're big, they're bright, and they definitely stand out in the smoke. You will have an idea of what your company is doing. If you see the colors going forward, you know to advance. If you see the colors falling back, you know to fall back. So carrying the colors was actually a great honor during the Civil War. If you were carrying the colors during battle and you fell, it was always customary for the closest man next to you to pick up the colors and to carry on, because if the colors fell, the regiment could go into complete disorganization. If that were to be able to happen, that wouldn't be a very good thing. So that's how the soldiers in the Pennsylvania ranks during the Civil War would live in camp. And here in a second, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some of these things on, and I'm going to show you what the soldiers would look like as they marched off. So if it's early in the morning and my comrades and I had just had breakfast, now the order is going to come that we have to get up and march. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to roll all these things up in the blanket roll, like I talked about a little bit earlier, and we're going to get ready to go out onto the road and march wherever it is that our commander has us marching to. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get up and I'm going to start putting on some of my equipment to be able to do that. So I'm going to take my haversack. Remember, all of my food items, my plate, my cup, everything that I have as far as that goes is going to be here in the haversack, and I'm going to put it over my right shoulder and on my left hip. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take my cartridge box. I'm going to put it on the opposite shoulder and on the opposite hip. Like so. Right like that. And of course, I don't want to go anywhere without my canteen. You see how I have the canteen sling kind of short. I don't want it hanging down too low because as I'm marching, I don't want it banging off of my leg. I want it to sit higher up on my back so it really doesn't become that cumbersome. You're also going to notice that this is going to be one of the last things that I put on. Reason being, if it's on the bottom, I'm going to have to take everything off just to get to it if I need a drink. So I'm just going to take it, and it's going to go right on my right shoulder, right toward the small of my back, right here. Now, of course, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have everything rolled up in the blanket roll, right like this, and it's going to go on just like that. So you can see why this would be much easier to carry than a knapsack. I don't have all of that weight on my back now, so of course a lot of the soldiers throughout the course of war would throw the knapsacks aside. You would see them along the side of the roads during a long march, and they would go to the blanket roll, especially in the Confederate Army. The Union Army definitely kept their knapsacks to a point, but a lot of the soldiers did carry the bedroll like what I'm carrying here. And of course, I wouldn't be a soldier if I went anywhere without my rifled musket. Now, this is an Enfield rifled musket. It was manufactured in England. Now, the Enfields were primarily used by Confederate soldiers. There were some Union soldiers who used them. Most of the Union soldiers carried what were called Springfield rifled muskets, manufactured at the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts. So, the rifled musket, I'm going to talk a little bit about it right now. You can see it has 3 bands, and inside the barrel, there are tiny grooves that create what are called rifling. So when the shot is fired, what's going to happen is the projectile or mini ball is going to come out and it's going to have a nice tight spiral on it, kind of like if you throw a football. If anybody out there is a football fan, you see a quarterback, when he throws that pass, he always puts the nice tight spiral on it. That's for better accuracy. The same is true when it comes to muskets. If it has rifling, it's going to be way more accurate than if it didn't. A lot of times you'll see soldiers would use what were called smoothbore muskets, and they didn't have rifling on the inside of the barrel. So whenever you pulled the trigger, the ball would kind of be bouncing around inside the barrel, and it wouldn't be as accurate as it would have that nice tight spiral with the rifling inside the rifled musket. So this is kind of heavy, but soldiers did get used to the weight rather quickly. So how you would load this is you would be at a position. This is called order arms. And if the command came to call company load, what you would do is you would take it and you would cast it about right in front of you. Now the first thing you're going to do is you're going to grab in your cartridge box, of course, and you're going to reach out and grab a small tube of paper. Inside that paper would be powder and the projectile, the mini ball. And what you're going to do is you're actually going to take it and you're going to bite it. And you're going to pour the powder and the ball down inside the barrel. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to take your ramrod out right here, and you're going to ram that down inside the barrel to make sure it's all the way down at the bottom. You hear the ping. That means that this rifled musket is clean. If it wasn't clean and had a bunch of old dirty powder in the bottom of it, it would just make a dull thud, but you can hear the ping. That means this is a clean weapon. So then you're going to take it back. You're going to put it back. Now when soldiers would do this, they would always use their pinky, because you didn't want to put your hand over top of the muzzle of the rifle, just for safety reasons. So you would take your pinky and you would put it back. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to prime the weapon. You're going to take the musket and put it at half cock. Now you're going to reach into this cap pouch that I talked about. You're going to pull out a small cap. It's called a percussion cap. And you would place it right here below the hammer. So what's going to happen is when you pull the trigger, the hammer is going to drop and it's going to create a spark when it hits that percussion cap, igniting the powder inside the barrel, and that's what's going to make the rifle fire. So once you do that, you're going to go back to the order or the shoulder arms position, because if the captain is walking along the line and he needs to know when everybody is loaded and ready to fire, if he sees that everybody's back to shoulder arms, he knows that the company is ready. If he still sees soldiers fidgeting around, trying to put their caps on, trying to load the weapon, trying to do anything else, he knows that they're not ready yet. If he looks down the line and all he sees are rifled muskets sticking straight up in the air, he knows that his company is ready. So the first thing that's going to happen is he's going to give the command, ready. The first thing the soldier is going to do is he's going to take his left foot or front foot and face it toward the direction. He's going to take his back foot and put it like a T right behind it. That's for stability. He's going to take the musket and he's going to hold it right like this, right in front of him. Next command that would be given is take aim. He would pick it up and fire. He would pull the trigger, the hammer would come down, igniting the percussion cap, and then you will of course have the soldier being able to fire a shot in battle. Much different than the weaponry we have today. So a good soldier in the Union Army could fire 3 well-aimed shots in 1 minute. A new soldier, a new recruit could probably get off 1, maybe 2 if he were lucky. But you have to remember, when you're firing these things in battle, it's not as easy as me just standing here on a nice sunny day doing it. Your comrades were falling around you. The smoke was very thick. You couldn't see 5 feet in front of you. Their bugles calls were being called in the background. Soldiers were screaming. They were falling all around. I mean, there was a lot of things going on. So to be able to do this under pressure and fire 3 well-aimed shots in a minute was a mark of a very good soldier. So soldiers would often carry anything they could with them on the march. Of course, they had their musket. They had the things that they would carry up in their bedroll or their knapsack. They slept in the dog tent. And of course, the colors were very important to any Civil War regiment. If you look at the colors, if you look close enough, you can see the Pennsylvania state seal up in the corner there. It's not a typical looking flag, because state pride was very important throughout the Civil War. So Pennsylvania soldiers, for the most part, did fight together. And a lot of the soldiers were very young. They enlisted whenever they were teenagers, and some of them served all the way throughout the course of the war, all the way through 1865. So that's what life was like for a Pennsylvania soldier in the American Civil War. It's a very important part of our history. So thanks for taking the time to spend with me today and being able to learn how they spent the years from 1861 to 1865.